30 seconds. 20 seconds. 10 seconds.
Hi,
My name's J.C. McCauley.
I'm Naisha McCauley, and you're watching AccessTV.org.
Good morning again. This is Jonathan Small, host and producer of Face to Face. And Face to Face is one of two different talk shows that I host and produce every single week live at AccessTV.org studios. Face to Face is a show that's designed to ask the guests the hard questions and give you, the viewers, the answers and information that you deserve to know. This morning on Face to Face, I have a guest who has done tremendous things in her hometown of New York and also is doing tremendous things in her new hometown of Charlotte, North Carolina. This person brings a tremendous amount of dedication and hard work to many different things that she believes in, and I feel very privileged to have her this morning on Face to Face. The guest this morning is no other than the president of the Charlotte Mecklenburg NAACP, also the executive director of ETU, no other than Reverend Corine Mack. Good morning, Reverend Corine. How are you doing?
Good morning. I'm well, and thank you for having me.
Okay, it's our pleasure. Reverend Corine, could you kind of let people know a little bit about yourself and background briefly before we get into our main topic of discussion?
Sure. I'm a native New Yorker, born and raised in Harlem, USA. I am a retired union vice president, transit worker, TW Local 100. I am the president of the Charlotte Mecklenburg NAACP and the executive director of UTU. Both organizations are civil rights and advocacy organizations. And I've been doing that in as well as prison ministry for 50 years now.
Okay. Reverend Corine Mack, like so many people throughout the country over since the last about 50 years and just accelerating, has done this new reverse migration pattern to the south, the southeast, the Sun Belt. Before we get into this particular topic, what came about towards your decision of relocating from New York City to Charlotte, North Carolina?
Initially, I came to Charlotte to check on my youngest daughter, whose job moved her here. And that Thanksgiving in 2005, I fell in love with the greenery, quite frankly, and the forestry of Charlotte, North Carolina. I did not know about the politics at all. But being a retired transit worker, I really wanted something different, and made a decision the following year to move here to Charlotte. It wasn't until I actually moved here that I realized there was some other things going on. It's beautiful on the outside, right? But not so great once you look at all the politics and the underbelly, as I say, of the organization. Keeping in mind, being a transit employee and a union officer for TW Local 100, I had a pension, two pensions, in fact. And so I moved here with income, which made a very big difference in comparison to some people who were born and raised here. And most people who move here usually move here because at the time that I moved here, it was more financially feasible to move here and purchase a home.
Well, I'm glad you just mentioned that. I mean, I don't want to stray away from our topics, but you said you relocated and moved down to Charlotte with two pensions and two sources of income, which made the transition a lot different and better than people that's basically born and raised there. And you said you found some differences once you got situated, particularly with the politics of the South, most likely a lot different than from New York. Maybe it's the old saying, sometimes the grass is greener on the outside. But would you say one of the key factors of making this transition to returning of the new migration to the South is having your finance and income in place before you decide to make a move, or does it vary for different people?
Well, let me explain this. Living in New York and Connecticut, in
Mm-hmm.
any eastern part of the country or northern part of the country is a lot more expensive.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the taxes were a lot lower here in the Charlotte area at that time,
Mm-hmm.
and it just made sense. I was living in Suffolk County. You know anything about New York City, it is not cheap
Mm-hmm.
owning a home in Suffolk County, and taxes are fairly high. And so I was weighing my options based on that, being a single woman, moving to a whole new another area, but realizing that financially I would be more stable if I moved to the South, which seemed to not be so Southern,
Mm-hmm.
meaning Charlotte was not so Southern,
Right.
quote unquote, but Southern enough. I found out, of course, later on that in Charlotte and in the state of North Carolina, if you were born Black and poor, the likelihood of you dying Black and poor was 100%. We're number 50th,
Mm-hmm.
number 50 in the country for Black upward mobility.
Mm-hmm.
And that's serious.
Right.
That's a serious concern. And so although we're the second largest banking system in the country, although there are very wealthy people living in certain pockets of Charlotte area and other cities in North Carolina,
Mm-hmm.
there is a larger population of people who look just like me who probably will never ever become economically sound because of the politics and the systems in North Carolina.
Well, you see, Reverend Corinne, and it's not even a fair question, but I'll state it anyway because you're actually doing the work, with your movement in the civil rights and other different areas, being president of the NAACP. So it may not be fair for me to state it this way, but sometimes you feel not so much guilty, but you feel like it's a little unfair that it is just all through your hard work. It's not like you was given anything. But you're doing something that many born and raised people in Charlotte, in some areas of Charlotte, just can't do. You have been able to make your money in the Northeast. You've been able to save and put your money to good use. And the people down there in some areas just can't seem to generate the type of revenue to own homes and to be self-sufficient and raise themselves out of poverty. If what you're stating, 50th ranking for the city of Charlotte as upward mobility. If you're born poor, most likely you're going to end up being poor for the rest of your adult life. So it sounds like to me, when you hear us talk about the new reverse migration, it's kind of locking out certain segments of people throughout the country, and it's not always giving people the whole realities on why it's being so prosperous and successful. Just want to get a little feedback on, the whole picture beyond just what people might think the new reverse migration to the South consists of.
You are absolutely correct. The bottom line is the narrative is a very positive narrative. When you talk about, moving to southern states, specifically Charlotte, because it is very beautiful.
Mm.
But if you don't have your own revenue coming here, it's going to be very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And quite frankly, there is a lot of conversation about creating a living wage. That's the thing that I talk about on a regular basis, but it's not happening.
Mm.
It's only been 3 years since the city workers themselves reached a $15 an hour income.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about sanitation workers in comparison to how much money they're making in New York City.
Mm-hmm.
And I talk about this with anyone who will listen to me. When you look at teachers here are making a dismal income in comparison to teachers in the West and in the North of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
We have to be intentional about paying the essential workers. We know that during the pandemic, it was glaring who the essential workers were. and most of them look like us. Most of them were African American and Latino people.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to be really honest about how we are treating workers who are considered to be essential, that we all utilize, that we all need, and pay them a living wage. Pay them an income that's going to give them a better quality of life. That has not happened yet. It looks as if throughout the country, quite frankly, the rich are getting richer and the poor are becoming poorer, and the middle class are now moving into the poverty area, unfortunately, and those who were impoverished are falling into an abyss. We have to do something intentional to change that.
But it seems like to me that the state of North Carolina and many other southern states realize as long as they have a ton of people from the North, the Midwest, and California, high expensive states who are basically able to sell their homes and make cash deal offers for homes in the South, that there may not be a need to try to change anything towards livable wages and to try to reinvest in the human capital that currently live in the Southeast. North Carolina and Charlotte as an example, because this is where you reside at. So as long as people have this type of money and income throughout the country, and the realtors and everybody down in the South can realize that they're going to continue to attract people to come to the South, some of the things that you're talking about may be unlikely to really change.
That's a good probability, but I can tell you this, in Charlotte specifically, there are a lot of investors who are purchasing properties and lands. And of course, when an investor, comes in, they're looking at 80% AMI. They don't care anything about 30% AMI. And so the language that we hear now is affordable housing, which I really don't like because it still isn't affordable. Affordable here is $55,000 or more for a family of four. But they know people are not making that amount of money, so they still can't get this beautiful building or this beautiful home or this beautiful apartment or condo. And the other side of the spectrum, which is really damaging, is you have communities here that were predominantly Black communities. Some of them were viable Black, working class communities that have been displaced because of the investors coming in and purchasing properties at these prices in which they simply can't afford. Most people who were born and raised here, who've been working here all their life, can't afford a $400,000 house. Just simply can't afford it. And so you're looking at gentrification on steroids in Charlotte right now.
Right. But again, the difference I think between the initial migration patterns from the South to the North and the Midwest was that poor people could basically move throughout the country and get low-paying entry-level jobs that they thought was much better than currently living in the oppressed, segregated South or southern states throughout the country. This new reverse migration pattern is a lot different. It's not like you're getting mostly, I would say, 80 to 90% of the people that are relocating to the South and the southern states are coming down there with some wealth, with some high education or some technical skills, comparable to just your everyday working person trying to get their foot in the door. So I think it's high numbers, obviously, when you look at the patterns, but it's still showing you that it's a lot different than the past migration patterns. And I think personally, as long as the economy and the capitalism is structured in a way that you have people willing to pay $400,000 and up for homes, I don't think your state elected officials and other factors of business people in North Carolina and other southern states are really going to be too concerned if people born and raised there can't really afford to purchase homes and live a good standard of living.
I think that's a good point, but I also believe because they're building so much and so often that eventually there's going to be a cap or maybe worse. I really believe that they're going to have to lower the rents because people simply are not going to be able to afford the rents. And like I own my home. I purchased my home. And everybody doesn't have the ability to do that. I thank God for blessing my life, but everybody can't do that. Some people still have to rent. When I initially moved here, there were a lot of apartments that had $600 rental. areas. Now, at minimum, they're $1,400, $1,500. A huge difference. And when I initially moved here, and that's probably happening everywhere else, but it's glaring here in the Charlotte area. And I am concerned because there's a rise in homelessness. Just 2 years ago, we had what we call a tent city here in the Charlotte area, where we had about 1,000 families living out in the tent in a big field. That shouldn't happen in any city of the United States.
Right.
Not when we're spending millions of dollars on wars and helping other countries. Not when we have immigrants coming into our country who definitely need our help, no question about it. But what about those folks who were born and raised here who are in need? How are we helping them? How are we ensuring that they're not living on the streets?
Well, you know, it almost sounds like these are some of the issues that you probably don't like about North Carolina and Charlotte. You know, there's probably 7, 8 things that you love about living in North Carolina and Charlotte, but maybe there's 2 or 3 key factors that you don't like about living in North Carolina. Would that be fair to say, or is it more?
I think that's fair. I think I think that Charlotte, as I said, is a beautiful place. I've met some wonderful people here, some really great organizers and activists here. I think that the way that we come together in the struggle for Black elevation is really important. And I think that the reason it's so important is because that work started in the South. We're standing on the shoulders of some Black men and women who have been in the struggle, who were harmed, who were brutalized, who even died, so that I can sit here and talk to you right now. So I never forget that. And I think that that's where my love for the South comes from. And not only that, most of us who are African American, we have descendants or even parents today who initially came from the southern area and migrated to the north, right?
Right.
And so we never forget that lineage. We never forget that history and that heritage of the South. It's a beautiful place to be. But when you compare Southern thinking, Southern caring and circles to Northern, for me, there's a vast difference. There is so much negative energy here in the Charlotte area. There is so many silos here in the Charlotte area, and a lot of selfishness instead of selflessness. And I understand why that is, because if you've been lacking for a long time, then any opportunity for you to gain something, you're not going to want to share. So I understand where it's coming from, but I'm hoping that at some point we can get to a place of real love and a true village concept so we can win.
So you're really concerned with the human capital beyond just the economic capitals, because it sounds like to me that, the selfishness that you just explained, that if people are doing well in Charlotte and in North Carolina, and it could go into the state elected officials and other policymakers, they really don't care about the bottom. Now, I hear some reports that the healthcare systems, the school systems, is really not that good in North Carolina and other southern states. But then when you talk to realtors and other business people, they'll tell you that we have great healthcare systems. We have a great school systems. So who's really correct? I mean, how is the school systems and the healthcare factors consist of in North Carolina?
Well, it depends on the perspective of the individual looking at the situation, right? I can tell you that I filed a lawsuit against the state legislators for educational inequity. So that should tell you something, that I filed a lawsuit.
Right.
And the Leandro Act, which was an act that was put in place in 1995, was initially won in 1997, and the money was never released. And when I began to look at the educational system in Charlotte and how Black and brown children were way behind, not only academically, but in terms of the structure, the school structures and their buildings and how recently they've been renovated or not. When I look at environmental injustice in the educational system, all those things were geared to Black and brown children being harmed. And so my lawsuit, it reenacted the Leandro Act, but it also talked about the harm that was done, the additional harm done during COVID, those
Right.
additional 2 to 3 years in which children lost so much academically.
Mm-hmm.
And we won. And the state legislators took us all the way to Supreme Court, North Carolina Supreme Court, and we won.
Mm-hmm.
A lawsuit that garnished an $8.9 billion win. And to date, they still have not released that money. We have to go back to court again because they're saying that technically the court didn't have the jurisdiction to make that decision.
Mm-hmm.
This is the insidious racism that we're dealing with in the North Carolina, state of North Carolina.
Exactly.
Okay? Our children are being harmed, and the state legislators who are predominantly more Republican do not want to release that money. Money that should be going directly into these schools so that the children are being given all the tools they need, all the resources they need to have a better, educational upbringing.
Mm-hmm.
More importantly, they began their budget cycle and finalized the budget cycle and pretty much gutted the public school system and put all the money in private and charter schools.
Mm-hmm.
That is racism 101. And so when I talk about the underbelly of North Carolina, that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about how the South is still very racist and how there is an intentional move to create the new Reconstruction, which would be, in my mind, Jim Crow 2.0.
But the one thing, Reverend Corine, people might find a little bit puzzling is with the racism. If you have so many black people in North Carolina, in Charlotte, and other cities, because someone told me this a long time ago about Atlanta, that it's hard to really distribute the real racism because you just have so many black people that live in the city. You know, you're outnumbered. And some reports indicate that Charlotte is one of the best cities for black-owned businesses, entrepreneurship. But is that really the case? Is it just a few people maybe that's doing well in black-owned businesses and other entrepreneurship beyond what some reports indicate?
My understanding is that North Carolina is about 40% black.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not that we have a lot of black. We have a lot of black people in leadership in Charlotte. Yes, Charlotte is considered to be a more progressive. So just consider this: we're more progressive. Guess what's happening in the areas that are more moderate or less, right? But my mom used to say something, and I really believe that, and I believe it more so now that I live here. All skin folk ain't kin folk. Just because someone's black doesn't mean that they are elevating black lives.
Right.
And a more important issue I want your viewers to understand is white supremacy has evolved. They've gotten smarter. That's why even in your workplace, it's difficult sometimes to bring discrimination cases against them because they'll go and hire someone who looks like you in a position of supervisor to be your direct manager. And so they're not the ones who fire you. It's the black person who's doing the firing.
Right.
It's a very smart tool, very smart way of doing it. And they're doing that across the board. They're also doing that in politics as well.
Right.
There are people who look like us who are in politics today who we vote for simply because they're black, because we want to have a black person. We feel so happy and excited to have a black person in position. And a person gets in position, does more harm to us than anyone.
So it's a different whole type of structure, how you can distribute white supremacy, if that's what you just outlined. Again, I want to stay kind of focused on this new reverse migration pattern and the movements that has been taking place for the past 3 to 4 different decades. Do you see more benefits of moving to the South and Southeast than staying in the Northeast and the Midwestern states?
I think the benefit would be if black people moved to the South with the intention of moving and elevating the communities. Not just moving, because it's more beautiful, because, it's not concrete jungle, but in fact, it's, more greenery, more parks. In most people's minds, it's safer to raise your children. But I can tell you that there's a rise in youth violence here in the Charlotte area, like everywhere else. Where else? It's just society has changed. I don't know what has happened to our humanity, but there's a lot of harm being done across the country. But I think that in terms of migrating to the South, it's important for Black people who come from very progressive areas like the West and in the East would come here with an intention to do some work to elevate these communities. I think that that would be awesome, and it's much needed. In my mind, coming out of Harlem with the background that I had, having all the opportunities I had, loving on people who were the foundations and sometimes the authors of civil rights, it gave me a passion for Black people and Black elevation. And I know a lot of folks are very similar to me. I would love for them to come here and just help us with the work, not just in the Charlotte area, but throughout the South. Let's build a real coalition to make some real changes.
Right, right. Well, the one thing is people want to get the truth about this migration pattern and what is determining and pushing the migration pattern. I think, like you mentioned, most people, whether you're a retiree, whether you're taking a job transfer, whether you're a young person coming out of high school or looking to go to college, there's kind of a groups of people that's really making up the numbers of people with the new migration to the South. But again, I think it would be better, like you just mentioned, if people came down there with the intentions on doing more than just self-gratification. I mean, there's nothing wrong with you wanting to have a good life, but it shouldn't always be at the expense of ignoring other people. I mean, it would be nice if you could have both. If you could bring a good quality of life down there, and you're doing a good example by being president of the Charlotte Mecklenburg NAACP. So you could have just came down there, retired, settled down, and forget about the masses of people. But you're a perfect example that that's not the case towards what you are moving towards.
No, but you're right. Socioeconomics plays a big part in moving to the South. Also think that because of the level of racism that we're dealing with and implicit bias and bias we're dealing with in this country, a lot of Black people feel comfortable in the South. We have that foundation here in the South that some folks may not feel in other parts of the country. But I also believe that we have a responsibility, and always did, even the migration that happened in the 1920s through the 40s. We had a responsibility to go to the North, go to the East, make good money, and then come back to the South and help our brethren. I really believe that.
Well, I think that's the biggest difference between this migration pattern. I think maybe with the exception of maybe your intermediate family, if they're not ready to make the relocation transition, most people are coming down with a mindset just to make sure that you have your life in order and not look at the masses. And I'm not saying a civil rights activist is for everybody, don't get me wrong, that's a big responsibility. But I think, as I mentioned and you just mentioned, the differences between the initial migration patterns to the North, the Midwest, and the Western states like California was, people was coming there looking to get started and then look for their family, but also look for close friends or look for friends in general. And I wasn't around, and I don't think you were around in that time span either.
No.
But I think people felt that it was a difference through history of how people was leaving. Because keep in mind, there was a tremendous amount of segregation and oppression in the South. Like, the system had their foot on your neck, and it was very little that you could do. So even if you came to, let's say, the Northeast, to the Midwest, inner city, Harlem was classified, and I don't want to put down your hometown, but Harlem was classified as, I hate to use this word, as a ghetto. It had a positive reputation, but it also had a negative reputation at the same time. And but Harlem was still, people felt that they could, from the South, have a better life than it currently existed at that time.
Well, even in Harlem, there were areas that were middle class, working class, and well-to-do Black people. In Cherry Hill in Harlem, and 150th Street and up. I lived on 152nd Street and St. Nicholas Place, which is considered to be Cherry Hill, in my later years, my 20s. that was considered to be the place to live.
Mm,
Of course, there were other areas in Harlem that was considered a ghetto, but let me say this, the difference between the ghetto there then and now is that we lived through the village concept. Everyone helped each other.
mm,
That's the experience that I have as a child, and I never forgot it.
mm,
If anybody needed anything, my parents were there helping. We had a large family. We had 13 children. My mother was still giving food to other families when my dad came home. We would share everything we had with other families, and they would share with us as well. We played with each other out in the streets, stickball and, ringalerio and other things. There was a love that we had and a connection that we had that you don't see today.
mm,
It was very different. Also, both my parents, who, my mother was born and raised in Daytona Beach, Florida. My father was brought here and lived in Georgia most of his youth. And so they migrated to New York and actually met in New York, but never forgot the South, always talked about the South. And in fact, every summer we came back to the South to see our family.
mm.
So I wasn't totally excluded from the Southern concept, Southern idea, or Southern living.
Right.
My point is, we need both. We need both the North and the South to come together to do this work. I had to remind somebody recently who kept telling us, if you're not a Charlotte native, you need to mind your business.
Oh.
And I thought about all the work that I do here in the South, and I'm not from here. And like, that is asinine. In fact, if we didn't come from the North to the South, you would still be enslaved. So what are you talking about?
Mm,
And you don't want to go there with someone, but that's the level of ignorance that I'm talking about. The level of separatism that we have between Black people.
mm.
Why would you make a comment like that? I wish that people wouldn't come here to Charlotte. Y'all messing it up. Are y'all kidding me? You just spoke about something very important. The rise of entrepreneurship of Black people in Charlotte is predominantly people who are natives, who are transplants.
Mm.
That's a huge thing. And
Right.
that's changing the social economics of not only that particular family, but other families working for them.
Mm.
That's a beautiful thing.
Yes.
So why are we saying things like, if you're not from here, you shouldn't be doing anything? You sound crazy.
But I wonder if the Black people who are telling you this, are they a little envious of people from other parts of the country, that you're coming down and you're doing better than us, or you're trying to change how we think? I mean, I don't know exactly what the reasons are for them making statements like that, but do you kind of have some understanding why you're being told things like this?
I think envy and jealousy is a huge dark spirit, and that may be what the case is. But I think it comes from a level of ignorance, quite frankly,
Mm,
for anyone to make a comment like that.
right.
Because this country is based on immigration. The
Mm,
whole country is,
right.
right? Even with white supremacists making comments about the immigrants coming in now, almost all of them are descendants of immigrants. That this country is built on immigration.
Mm,
And I just think that we need to get back to a level of humanity and even civility to some extent, but more importantly, loving ourselves and loving others. We have gotten so far from that. It's so hurtful. And I'm looking at our children and our children's children, how now they're interacting with one another. And it's not healthy. It's not with compassion.
mm,
And so that's a problem in itself. But back to this new migration that we're dealing with, I am happy to see so many people of color, specifically Black people, moving to the South.
mm,
I'm happy to see at least 77 new transplant move to Charlotte daily.
mm,
Out of the 77, 1/3 are Black people.
mm,
That excites me
right.
because that means we're evolving and we're growing. That
Mm,
means that we're going to be better, not worse off.
mm,
We need to, when I say we, that's all of us, with all race, creed, color, religious belief, sexual orientation. We need to come together to make sure that we're creating systems to benefit all people. We need to make sure that there's infrastructure that's going to be able to support these large moves of people, this influx of people coming into the Charlotte area. That's what we need to be looking at. not so much trying to find ways to exclude people, but to include people.
Well, also keep in mind, it's not just black, and I think you kind of mentioned it with the number. It's not just black people that are moving to the South in this type of new migration pattern. You have many white people, many other ethnic races of people that are, and also international people. I think Charlotte and other parts of North Carolina is turning somewhat into an international magnet too. And it may not clearly be like New York, but certainly when people look at this new migration pattern, I don't want people just to come away with it that it's just black people alone that's making up the numbers. You have many different races of people that are deciding that they're leaving the Northeast, Midwest, high expensive states and are going to the South and Southeast to some degree.
That's correct. And that's why, I wanted to clarify that out of 77 people, one third are black, or people of color. But there are people coming from all walks of life, coming into the Charlotte area. And to go further, when you think about the weather, when you think about New York, I know that the day that I moved, it snowed 17 inches of snow. And I had a huge driveway in my house in Suffolk County. I had to shovel all that snow. My very last day there, I was so hot. In the mind of most of us, when you think about the South, the climate is much warmer. The environment is much nicer. But unfortunately, due to climate change, is not as much as it used to be when I first moved here. But it's still a lot warmer than, living in New York City. When it snows in Charlotte, I have not experienced in all of years I've been here now, ever having to shovel more than 2 or 3 inches of snow.
Exactly.
I'll take that.
Well, people, again, the realtors and other people who are trying to promote the Southeast will tell you that's the first thing they always mention is that we get very little snow down here and the weather is not really cold. They have cold spells, but it's not like the Northeast. And believe it or not, even up here in Connecticut, we're going through somewhat of a mild winter pattern over the past 3 years. It may eventually turn back to normal, but the weather factor, I guess cost of living, comparable like what it costs to live in New York and California is very expensive. And I believe that's going to still continue to drive many people from those areas of the country to less expensive areas. And the thing you want to keep in mind is, though, even though the cost of housing is getting more expensive in the South, it's still nowhere near what it would be like in New York and California and Boston.
Yes, and the other factor I think is for Black people specifically is HBCUs. There are a lot more in the southern area than there are in the north. So I think that's another factor. If you have children who are thinking about going to an HBCU, then you would think about coming to the southern area.
Right, right. Well, I mean, Reverend Corine, we covered a lot of areas. I really appreciate your wisdom and your expertise. And I mean, you definitely took this topic beyond the new reverse migration, but you still kept it relative towards this whole subject matter. And I really appreciate your availability, particularly under short notice. And I think I was very impressed with how you came across this morning with this particular interview segment. As we're ending or wrapping up this, you're welcome. As we're ending and wrapping up this particular segment, is there anything you want people to know either about yourself, Charlotte, North Carolina, or anything in general?
Well, if you're going to be here January 13th, we have challenged the police department. They've expanded it to all law enforcement now. The activists against law enforcement, we have a basketball tournament. And so you're welcome to come to that at Northside Baptist Church at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The Charlotte NAACP branch has also won the ability to be the host for the 2025 National NAACP. So that's a great opportunity for you to come and see if you like the Charlotte area in 2025. It's usually in July. We'll have the National NAACP here in the Charlotte Mecklenburg area.
Right. Always like to try to end this particular show on a somewhat positive, good note, and I think you just exemplified that with your last commentaries. So again, Reverend Corine Mack, it was a pleasure having you on this particular network, accesstv.org, which was an excellent fit, and you presented a very excellent presentation. And I wish you the very best of luck with many different movements that you are part of. And I think people definitely should know about your life and what you're doing. And we kind of outline, I guess, the good and the bad of the South. And I think we left off on a good, positive note.
Thank you again for having me. And God bless you.
Okay, God bless you too. You're welcome. Okay, this is Jonathan Small. I had enjoyed this segment of Face to Face this morning. Reverend Corine Mack, the president of the Charlotte Mecklenburg NAACP, to go along with the executive director of the ETU. And she's doing tremendous things. She's a very passionate woman, and she brought a lot of her dedication and work, as I mentioned in the introduction to this particular segment. This program, again, has the option of one or two different programs. It could either be face-to-face or it could be all about you. I think people know me a little bit by now. I try to keep it balanced, so it's very likely next week this will be an all about you segment. But again, as I say, even last week, you never know if a dynamite guest or topic comes about and it needs to be outlined on face-to-face. That particular segment can also be produced and hosted here. So again, until I see you again next week, if it's God's willings, for people out there, have a very peaceful and blessed day. Thank you.